I think it's ambiguous enough where it doesn't really give you a complete intent of how high I'm going to go, and it's not so low that we're taking a $40 player and starting him at 1, because it drives me crazy when people do that. Some people argue, they say, oh, well, if I throw him at 25 instead of 1, there's a 1 in 1,000 chance I'm going to get the player for 24. And if it's a $40 player, there's not a 1 in 1,000 chance you're going to get him for that price. It's just not going to work like that. So, keep things moving, I guess, is one of my early tactics, especially just because I think people make bad decisions when they have to hurry. That's my main reason for doing it. The quicker we can get closer to the sale price, the less time everybody at the table has to think about how that player and how those stats and how that price fits into their roster.
Yeah, well, when it's down to $5, $6, $7 players, I'll throw out 1 or 2 because
Sure.
I don't want to make the mistake of this guy's worth 6 and I bid 3 and that's it, and I could have gotten him for 1. But yeah, if there's a player worth 25, I'll start something much higher. I've tried before throwing out random bids. The idea is I don't want people to call any attention to what I'm doing. I want to hypnotize people and be dull. And I've tried random. I've actually noticed you're better off doing some number, 19, 19, 19, so that it just gets lost. Oh, he always starts out with 19, whatever. That you can't tell whether I want the player, I don't want the player. I'm just going to say 19, whatever it is. And I'll pick a different number each auction. Some auctions it'll be 12, some auctions will be 18. Sometimes I'll be funny and I'll go, quarter, 5. I'll make funny gestures, but it'll always be the same funny gesture as to hypnotize people or to get people laugh. It's also about having fun. You want to make the room smile. So, if you can inject that personality, just like you would do in poker, right? You want to tell a joke at the poker table. It's a good tactic to get people to do things. Anything I missed, Ruvain?
Yeah, one other thing. If you're by yourself, you're doing the auction by yourself, and you're falling behind, and you want to get some time to catch up, that's when you get like a $15 player. You start him at 1. And if you know you don't want him, then you'll have some time to catch up, to see what's going on, and get your bearings of the room again.
Derek, talk about either freezing the room, where you just bid a very high bid close to what you'd pay for, and also can you talk about price and forcing? Do you think that you should bid the extra dollar to get somebody up, or is that a bad idea?
So I think freezing the room works. It's almost like, man, it's like throwing the ethos out there in some ways. It has to be a little bit unexpected to really work optimally. And I would say that in a typical auction, especially with expensive players, I'm probably not trying to freeze the room more than once. I mean, it's just one of those things. Later on, maybe if we're in the most players left are going for $5 or less, and there's a handful of people that can go more than $1 for their bid, maybe then you can throw a freeze bid out there. But to me, that's not quite the same, right? It really is only a true freeze bid if the entire room, for the most part, could bid and doesn't, because you kind of stick the landing with the perfect number. So I wouldn't do it a lot. I would do it with a really high-end polarizing player if I was going to do it. Probably Adalberto Mondesi, right? Like if you have a fixed number, you're like, you know what? I like Adalberto Mondesi at $29. That's my number. I'm not going to pay $30. 29 is a number I'm comfortable with. This is the first time I'm nominating a player in this auction. I want to know if I have Mondesi on my team right away. So I'm going to throw him out there at my max bid because people aren't really sure if they want to build around him. And it goes back to what I was saying before, right? You shorten up the amount of time people have to make that decision, you might end up getting the player you want at the price that you want. But I would definitely be careful about throwing multiple players. Like we're talking a handful of players at 20 plus trying to freeze bid people. I don't think that is a very effective way to go. I mean, if you believe you can do it, go for it. But I don't think that tactic works well if you do it too often.
Ruvain, do you believe that somebody should bid on every player or on most players, or should you bid more sparingly?
I think bidding on every player gives you the advantage of making the room think that you're getting every player. It confuses everybody, and it helps in the fact that people can't see what strategy you have, and that's really a big advantage. As for the freeze bid, me and you, Ira, we discussed this before Labor, and we decided just on a lark, because we normally don't do this, to throw Rafael Devers out for $30. And we did that last year, and we heard crickets. and we were ecstatic. It's very rare, and just like Derek said, you have to pick the right player, the right time, and the right amount. Otherwise, it's and you can't do it more than once. It's like exactly the Ephus pitch you mentioned. You can't do it more than once, otherwise someone's gonna be waiting on that.
Correction, though, we put out $24 for Devers.
I'm sorry, it was $24.
Yeah, we got a really nice plan, and we froze the room on that. And we looked at each other. That was I have that was my first live expert auction and my first nomination ever, and I got a freeze bid there. But I agree with you, Derek. I would only use that once or twice a game if that if that makes sense. Last question on this topic. Do you believe in the fact that people won't go to 0? So if you bid 19, you have a better chance of getting a guy. So if the bidding goes 16, 17, jump to 19, and you won't get another. I guess there's two questions in there. One is do jump bids work by jumping 2? And also the question of, is there something about the 9s that you've noticed?
It seems like there's something about the 9s. I don't know if there's any research that's been done lately on that. But if you look at a board, you see a lot of 19s, 29s, 9s later on. It's why so many prices in this world end in 9. There is something to that. Whether or not it's always worth it to go from 17 to 19, I mean, depends on the player, right? If you're talking about someone who's going to go for 21 or 22 more often than not, jumping from 17 to 19, it's worth it in case you get the couple bucks off. If you don't, someone goes 20, you jump in at 21, and you still got a shot at getting the player right around the value. So I'm comfortable bidding that way and putting the extra dollar in those bids. I don't know if it helps me win players at an extraordinarily high rate. It's one of those things that you're just kind of feeling out the situation with who you're bidding against and who you're bidding on and what those projections look like, probably on everybody's sheet, hopefully in most cases, which, again, like I've said this before, one of my favorite things about projections is that it gives you some insight into what everybody else in the room wants to do with players.
Right. I'll tell you my thoughts on those. I don't think that there's anything to the 9s. I've done a little bit of research on some home leagues that I've done, and I've actually noticed that the 0s are a bigger factor. Like if you bid 20, less people will go to 21 as opposed to 19 to 20. That's the research I've seen, but it's a small sample size to tell you that it's true. As far as jump bids, I don't think that it helps me get players anymore. But I do think that I feel less bad if I don't get the player and I jump bid. So if I jump bid 2 and then somebody bids above, I'm like, okay, at least I jumped at 2. I would have felt much worse if I bid 1 and they bid 1 over, and then I don't know, I don't want to go that extra buck and they got him. I'm like, why didn't I just go that extra and jump bid 2? So I don't think it works to get many more players, but I feel better about myself. And, of course, it's all about feeling better, right?
Well, one other thing that we do is if we know the players, let's say, is worth $21, sometimes we want to stay on the odd numbers. So if we're like 17, or if someone bids 16, we'll jump to 19 as opposed to jumping 1 or 2, 2 jumping 3 instead, because we want to stay in that range of the price of the player.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. If you have a set price in mind for what you want to play, it's good to get on the odds or the evens. If you know you're going to bid up to 21 and it is even, then switch it to odd. That is a good point, and I found that actually is more helpful than just the jump bidding or the 0s, 9s things. All right. Well, anything else to add about auction strategy before we wrap up our strategy section? This was really good tonight, Derek. I think we had a lot of good tidbits and information to give everybody.
Yeah, I mean, I think people, if they've watched me auction, more often than not, I do probably spend a lot of money quickly, but that's not necessarily what I'm going to do if I don't like the prices. I think some people get really married to stars and scrubs versus a balanced approach going in, and I would say you really need to be able to build a team both ways, depending on what's happening in that particular room on that particular day.
Yeah. Oh, one question I do want to ask, though, is draft inflation. I know a lot of people track draft inflation. If everybody's going over, then you should see some prices falling, or that you wait for the point where prices are falling. Do you track draft inflation or think that exists or anything to it?
I don't track it with precision. I know you could sit there and, like, if you had a pad of paper or if on your spreadsheet you wanted to keep adding in the values and have it calculate inflation for you. You could do that. I think I feel like I've done enough auctions where I sort of know, right? If we're 2, 3, 4 over value on the first 40 or so players, then a lot of the $3 and $4 players at the bottom of the pool, they just became $1 players, and that's okay. And if that surplus bidding is more than $2, $3, or $4, or if it's more than the first 40 or so players, then you start to get to the point where the mid-tier players start to come at significant discounts, and that's when things get really interesting. I mean, that's what happened in mixed tout last year. Everybody pushed hard at the top, and the whole bottom half of the pool went for a lot less than it should have, which when that happens, that's kind of jarring. When the first scenario I described happens, that's pretty normal for the auctions that I'm in.
Yeah, that helps a guy like Jeff Zimmerman who just plays $15 players, or Jason Gray used to do, I think, because you can scoop up all those people in the middle. But I don't believe in draft inflation. I think I'm like you. I've done enough of these to just know it off the top of my head. Other than we track market premiums. We want to know how much we have to pay to be in that tier, but I don't really track it as it goes on. I will say though that keeper inflation, that is real. If you have normally you have $260 projected for $260 of value. If you have keepers and you're buying players cheaper, you might have $20 less of money, but only $10 less of value to get. So each player is worth more only because you've kept players at bargain. So that is true, but that's not an in-draft thing. That's something that you just have to set up your values before the auction. All right, so we are going to do some ATC player discussion today for a little bit. Only a couple players today since we had a long discussion about strategy. Today we're going to start our outfielders discussion. And again, the way we do it is we check ATC values versus what the ADP is saying to talk about which players might be worth zoning in on if you want to get a bargain, and we'll do a little bit of a deep dive to see whether we want them. Our first outfielder is Bryce Harper, and it's now time for the Injury Gurus Trivia of the Week.
Well, we're going to be talking about Bryce Harper now. Bryce Harper had 8 stolen bases last year. There were 7 outfielders who had 10 or more stolen bases, but only 2 of those 7 also had 10 or more home runs. So name the 2 players who had 10 or more stolen bases and 10 or more home runs that that were eligible in the outfield last year.
It's a great question.
One of them, I'm going to give you a hint. One of them was in the top 50 ADP from last year, and one of them was in the 250 to 300 range of ADP from last year.
Got to be Mookie Betts, right?
Mookie Betts was the one who was in the top 50. Yes, he did that. There's one other player who did it.
Luis Robert?
Who? No, he
Luis Robert?
He missed by 1 stolen base. The answer is actually Trent Grisham. Which is very interesting because he was going anywhere between 250 and 300 last year, which means that you can get stolen bases later in the draft. They will be there. So that's something to look into, especially with Bryce Harper. Bryce Harper had 8 stolen bases, so he only missed it by 2 last year. He was actually on pace for almost 30 homers, 18 stolen bases, 90 plus RBIs. His average was pretty decent, 270 average. He lowered his K rate from last year. His BABIP was also a little bit low last year, so I think there'll be some bounce back from the average as well. And he had the lowest soft contact rate of his career at 9%. His walk rate went up. All these things are positive. These are numbers that could be similar. I'm not saying he is, but could be similar at the end of the season to someone like Mike Trout. He can hit those 40 home runs. He can steal more bases than Mike Trout at this point because they're about the same age, but it seems like Bryce Harper is still stealing while Mike Trout's stolen bases are going down.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on Bryce Harper, Derek? I mean, to me, Bryce Harper is a 5-category player. He's going to steal 15 bases like he always does. He's going to hit, high 30s homers. His strikeout rate isn't crazy, so I don't see much batting average downside. I mean, we're talking 260s at the bare minimum. If you look at his ATC interprojectional standard deviation, it's on the lower side. He's less risky. He's a guy who is going to finish pretty high up and has a pretty high floor. I think that with the fact that pitching is being pushed up so much, somehow Bryce Harper is being pushed out of the first round, and really his value deserves to be in it. So if you're lucky enough to get him